We're back, Truthstream Media Live on Unbound Radio, and we're getting ready to talk a little bit about the 4th of July, a little bit about our Declaration of Independence. And the more I talk to people from my mother's generation and back, they're saying they don't even recognize this country anymore. But even we don't recognize it from when we were kids. The amount of freedom we don't have in this country as it becomes basically a police state and no longer the land of the free. And so we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to read part of this having to do with the long train of abuses. And when we're talking about this, try to think about what you're seeing in our country today and what our forefathers were dealing with 237 years ago. So I'm just going to read an excerpt and we're going to go back and forth on this. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. Isn't that the truth? But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
And so why did they declare independence all those years ago in 1776? Number one, he has refused assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good.
He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended he has utterly neglected to attend to them.
He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only, disenfranchising them.
He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures.
Bureaucratic tyranny. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions of the rights of the people.
He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within.
He has endeavored to prevent the populations of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, raising the conditions of new appropriation of lands.
He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers.
He's made judges dependent on his will alone, not on the law, for the tenure of their offices and the amount of payment of their salaries.
He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance.
That one bears repeating. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. That sounds very familiar.
This all sounds pretty familiar. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures.
And we're there again. He's affected to render the military independent of and superior to civil power. We're there again, too.
He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. United Nations, anyone?
For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, we could be there again with foreign troops. For protecting them by mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit upon the inhabitants of the states. That was a major issue.
How about for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world and for imposing taxes on us without our consent?
Depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. Due process is very under threat today.
NDAA. For transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses.
That also falls under NDAA, at least potentially. For abolishing the free system of English laws in neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, enlarging the boundaries to render it once as an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule in colonies, for taking away the charters, abolishing most valuable laws, altering fundamentally the forms of our government. That wonderful song from the Byrds is based on Ecclesiastes 9:11 that says everything has its time under the sun. Many people say that the great republics, the great empires, go in cycles of 200 years where the people under the threat of tyranny yearn for freedom, and then after a while they become decadent and begin to rot, begin to lose hold of their freedom, and things turn over again. I hope we're not facing that time, but there's many signs that show America, the United States, may be facing that period. But if we are, if that's all we can do, let's at least plant the seeds of freedom so that new generations can once again claim it. Now, we just read many of the long train of abuses from the Declaration of Independence. We got through most of them, not quite all of them.
It's a lot.
But they are so telling, and what's shocking is how much history repeats itself, how many of those train of abuses, when you cut through the antiquated language, resonate exactly with today.
Isn't it Stuart Rhodes from Oath Keepers that said we're going through the long train of abuses right now?
Stuart Rhodes did say that, and I totally agree with him. And we've been trying to hammer out our own list. It's not official, and we can't even decide which one to focus on.
What
but
goes where? It's not in order either.
We'll try to start somewhere, and just for openers, I put generally violating the restrictions upon government under the Constitution, etc., in a manner that infringes upon our lives to their detriment.
And not just our lives, but the lives of people, obviously, in other countries, which we're seeing this week. And
Right.
We've been seeing repeatedly. Apparently, this nation has invaded 70 other nations since 1776, and 50 of those happened after 1945, so after World War II. And
Shocking.
right now, the only war that's actually been declared right now is Afghanistan, if I'm not mistaken, which they keep saying we're going to leave Afghanistan, but we just keep staying there, and there's still estimates to say that we're going to keep soldiers there till 2024, but, you know, we've still got soldiers in other places from the Vietnam War, from the Korean War even. I mean, we've got people everywhere. We've got bases all over this world, and so we've got boots on the ground in Libya, or we had boots on the ground in Libya, probably still do. We're drone striking Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia. We're building new drone bases in Africa. We're drone striking all these places when there's no due process. We don't even know what the process is to kill supposed suspected people. The war on terror is phony. Anyway, it's based on lies. It's meant by its very definition to never end, and all of it's based on completely dubious evidence.
And then in the name of fighting all that, they've set up the Patriot Act, the NDAA, the TSA, the Homeland Security,
right,
all of which have infringed upon our rights, whether they be agencies or supposed laws. And again, from the Declaration of Independence, the swarms of officers created in new offices to eat out the substance of the people.
There
and
are
how true is that?
73 armed federal agencies. So 73 of our federal agencies have armed officers. They call them special agents. I mean, why do we have that? Why is the Department of Homeland Security, which is supposed to be domestic only and is supposed to be securing the homeland, Das Homeland, buying so many billions of bullets? This isn't Costco. They don't need to save up. Come on. I mean, it's ridiculous. Why is the Department of Education armed?
But the other important thing is that word right there you have in quotes, special agents. Why is it a special situation? The Constitution outlines the basic framework for what government can't do, and the Bill of Rights makes damn sure a certain 10 things will not be done by government, even though they're doing them. But look what was in the Declaration of Independence, how the king had set up new lands not subject to his own laws, where things were done outside of law and basically used as economic warfare against them. Today we have all these special agencies with special situations, and I'm telling you, one of the biggest things that they do is use emergency powers to get outside of the Constitution. That's why you see so much activity under continuity of government, which is directly involved in all the stuff Homeland Security is doing.
Well, that's what they're protecting. They're not protecting the people. That's
Homeland Security has never caught a terrorist, but they have built up a massive continuity of government structure and all kinds of special rules where if they say the word terrorist, like you say fire in a theater, you can run right around the Constitution and basically do whatever you want and go as far as putting tanks in the streets and knocking on people's doors. They did it in Boston, by the way, after that marathon bombing, which was totally staged, and we've analyzed that and really shown a lot of the key evidence, but they locked down that whole city, had literal like SWAT team level tanks.
Martial law everywhere.
Martial law, locked people in
armored personnel carriers.
And then furthermore, with the special status, the emergency powers, we've seen it under globalization, how they're going to have global trade rules, NAFTA, GATT, WTO, but then they will create special economic zones where certain select companies can operate tax-free with slave
pay people
labor,
14 cents an hour,
not even pay the import duties or go through the system of the country where the location's physically based, because they will have a special free zone.
Yeah, look at what happened to Jamaica for more on that, people.
And everywhere the IMF has been, but that's the King of Britain's specialty, and our specialty today is creating specialty physical zones as well as mental zones where they are exempt from their own rules and have special status. It is so detrimental to our freedom.
Exactly. And then, speaking of that, you have the NDAA, where they're definitely detaining us without charge or trial. Suspicions of terrorism, once again, they just have to say it, fire in a theater. Completely dubious definitions there. And the Patriot Act, warrantless wiretapping. I mean, let's look at what the Fourth Amendment actually says. I'm going to read it. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, in particular describing the place to be searched, the persons or things to be seized. So nowhere in that whole sentence I just read, a couple sentences there that I just read, does it say anything about, it's an NSA free-for-all, let's build a $2 billion spy hub and track everyone everywhere.
It's insane what they've done. And they've also been collecting revenue through the color of law outside of anything that's constitutionally amended, even the IRS and the 16th Amendment not properly ratified.
Yeah, the government doesn't have that power. Filmmaker Aaron Russo made the film America, Freedom to Fascism. If you haven't seen it, you need to go see it. You can watch it on YouTube for free. But he went out to find the law that actually requires Americans to pay taxes on their labor and couldn't find it. And the Supreme Court ruled that the government has no authority to impose that, a direct, unapportioned tax on the labor of the American people. And the 16th Amendment does not give the government that power.
Right. And obviously the economic warfare through the Federal Reserve, also created through fraud, but just in general, all the collection of this tax revenue to pay for how many alphabet agencies that have been just created out of thin air, and all of them to the detriment of our freedom, all of them eating out our substance, or nearly all of them, all their supposed goods they're doing to support people in need, really just rings hollow after you really look into the nuts and bolts of what any number of these departments have done. Department of Education, just pick one.
Yeah, well, and our economy is being shut down. Obama's making good on his promise to kill coal. Jobs are being shipped overseas. Like I said earlier, only 47% now of American adults in this country even have a full-time job. And hundreds of thousands of people are falling out of the job market every single time a new jobs report comes up. They're just falling out because they've tried so long to find a job they couldn't find it. Household income has declined 5.6% since 2009, when our so-called economic recovery began. And Charles Krauthammer came out recently and said Obama's a bystander to this presidency, which is pretty obvious since he's going on $100 million trips to Africa. He doesn't give a crap. He doesn't care at all. And it's pretty obvious. And now we've got Obamacare getting ready to come in, which is making even more companies jump ship. And the Supreme Court is saying it's constitutional because it's a tax, even though Obama said it was a mandate, not a tax, but it's a fine. And it's a fine if you don't get in line and buy it. And basically the government can force you to buy something that it helped come up with in backroom, off-the-record deals with the very pharmaceutical and insurance companies that stand to benefit from that law. And that's really what we have here. We don't really, it seems to me, even have a government. We just have a face of a government planted over the top of corporations like a mask. When is the last time we've heard of a law that wasn't passed to benefit a company? We have a government that's passing laws to protect mega corporations like Monsanto at the expense of our basic ability to know what's in our food, allowing companies to knowingly put harmful chemicals in food, the de minimis Delaney clause, instead of just saying, hey, you can't have cancer-causing agents in the food, we're going to read it as a de minimis so you can have some. I mean, so that companies can pay to make that crap and put it in your food. I mean, it's like that joke from The Matrix where they show the little kid and he's got the spoon and he's like, there is no spoon. It's like that. There is no government, only corporations.
Oh, it very much is. And you've got to look at the government as a medium, as an interface. Let's say metaphorically the government resides on the television, but all these big corporations have bought out the politicians, the duly elected seats in the Congress. Those are like the channels. And so they bought up each one of the channels, and those channels broadcast basically the agenda of those corporations, and they've taken over the channels that were supposed to be theoretically allocated to the people. So we've been disenfranchised. They've taken away our seat of power in the government, and thus the government has been rendered over and over and over effectively illegitimate. It's farcical, and it's really pretty irrelevant. We go through the spectacle of elections. We're even witnessing in the Middle East the spectacle of revolutions, and it's all illusory because the military-industrial complex and the biggest corporations are predetermining it. And on top of all this, let's go back just for a moment to the actual Declaration of Independence. They say, he has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. And we see that certainly in the case, both fitting with the metaphor and literally, in the United Nations, which is physically seated in New York City, but is in a jurisdiction outside of our Constitution and outside of our laws. And it's been bolstered supposedly by treaty law, which is granted to the Senate constitutionally, but they are not granted the power to circumvent our Constitution. Any treaty that's made that violates our Constitution or Bill of Rights is supposed to be null and void. But just take a look at what the United Nations is doing, and none of it's helping people around the world. They're helping aid conflict so that bankers can come in and intervene, so that new invented agencies can go in there and get graft and work and take over the policies and agendas of our nation, of many nations all around the world. And again, you've seen this government aid the policy of protecting the bankers after the banking crisis of 2008. Back in the 90s, you saw them legalize the stealing of money from people's investments and savings for banks to go and invest with on the derivatives market, on the international, globally linked domino market, by instilling Glass-Steagall. All this should be illegal, common sense. You mentioned the poisoning of our food, and they, instead of jailing them, instead of stopping them, they give aid and comfort and cover to these companies that are knowingly put known carcinogens into our food and basically doing practices that are known to be harming people, known to be dangerous, and therefore are criminal. But instead of shutting them down, they create loopholes so they can have low-level presence of carcinogens, knowing it's in everything, and it builds up. This stuff just goes on and on. I'm not trying to rant. What else do you have on your list?
It does go on. And the people, I think, at this point are just so desensitized to this kind of corruption. We're so used to seeing them. And what was this latest one, the Monsanto Protection Act? And they said, we don't even know how that got in the bill. And since no one reads any bills anyway, they could put any freaking thing in there they want. I mean, they could just put a bunch of gibberish in there.
Obviously,
apparently,
the people aren't reading it, but
no one's reading.
The legislators aren't reading it either.
No one's reading it, and they said they didn't even know how it got in there. It magically appeared. It was magical, and then they just signed it, and that's fine because it's going to protect, the revolving door that is our government with the corporations that have taken over.
Knowing we've been taken over, I submit the biggest question is, how do we defund them? How do we get them to stop subsidizing all the wrong stuff, stop subsidizing the development of GMO, stop subsidizing the banker takeover of our funds and our hard-earned money, stop subsidizing foreign countries that are going to become our enemies or work with us in creating new enemies.
Truthstream Media Live is back on Unbound Radio. I'm your co-host, Melissa Melton, here with Aaron Dykes. And right before the break, he was asking, what do we do? Because our government's obviously not our government. People are used to the fact that it's not our government. And I'm going to go ahead and submit to you, Aaron, I'll reread this sentence from the Declaration of Independence. Accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. I feel like that really, when I read this, that just hits hard. That's what we're seeing everywhere. People are just zombified, walking through this situation. They're used to it. We're used to it when we see Benghazi going on, and then we see the IRS going on, and then the NSA going on. And when's the last time you even turned on the news where our government was doing something that didn't suck?
And we are suffering a new form of slavery. Many people have observed and said that it's a debt-based, economic-based form of slavery. Now, I'm not trying to make undue references to people who were in chains and who were dehumanized to the point of being considered 3/5 of a human. That's horrible. It's repulsive. And certainly many of our founders played a role in it. But how many of you knew that the original Declaration of Independence in the draft included one of the long train of abuses was that the British government would not allow the colony of Virginia to end the slave trade? It happened. It didn't make it into the final draft, but that's something that happened in history. It doesn't mean they were all do-gooders. In fact, Virginia was, of course, the largest slave-owning state. But there was a movement amongst their highest political officers, including Jefferson and Madison and others, Patrick Henry, all of which owned slaves, to end the slave trade. They weren't going to immediately abolish slavery, but it was the best compromise they had leading up until the point of revolution. And the British government forbid them from ending the slave trade and beginning the end of slavery. And instead it became entrenched for many more years. And how awful is that? And how much do we put up with today when 40% of Americans have a full-time job and all of global trade is being more and more controlled through NAFTA and GATT and the World Trade Organization and United Nations agreements for AIDS and these really backwards, ridiculous policies where we've allowed ourselves to contribute money for the relief of people who need money when all the policies just they create more problems and enslave us.
The money, I mean, we've got 1 in 5 Americans here on food stamps. We have the highest number of people on food stamps ever. And we're sending all this money in supposedly foreign aid to countries like Egypt, where it's supporting the Muslim Brotherhood so they can buy Lockheed Martin's weapons of war, or we're sending it through USAID to supposedly starving sub-Saharan Africa, when really what we're sending them is GMO from Monsanto and their ilk, or we're sending them, or we're recommending that they use different fertilizers in their countries that are made by all of our major companies like Syngenta and Dow. I mean, what are we really sending when we send this foreign aid? We're really just further.
I don't know what you want to get into on the other side, but that might be good to talk about the GMO aid to Africa and what they've done to Iraq since the war.
Oh, yeah. We've been doing some research for the upcoming mini documentary we're trying to put out. It just keeps getting bigger every time.
We've been deep into a research of, we were thinking of premiere it this week, but we decided to stick to quality, by the way, if anybody was tuning in for that. But we're working on the mini documentary, Contamination, and instead of being totally big picture, we've just focused in on one specific incident just to highlight.
But it turns into a big picture. It always does.
And what it reveals is not even something about that company or even something about GMO, but what a farce our government regulation is and how much our government is the main sponsor of genetically modified foods and the reason they proliferated so much.
And they put out these, they put out these organizations like USAID so people can see that and feel good about, we're sending aid to the starving African children. I feel so good about America doing that, but really what we're sending them is Monsanto products. I mean, that's what we're doing. So, and when they didn't want to take it, when that first began in the early part of last decade, they didn't want to take it. We said, well, beggars can't be choosers. That's what we said to them. That's what the USAID said to the starving people.
Is it any surprise that food would be used as a weapon when they've observed since the time of Napoleon that an army moves on its stomach?
When Henry Kissinger wrote Memorandum 200 that said we should use food as a weapon in these developing countries.
Well, we're still living through that age. That's still the current policy.
Exactly.
And, going back to the founding age for one more snippet here, there was Dr. Benjamin Rush. He was never a president or I think he was maybe a member of the Continental Congress. I don't recall offhand. But he was a doctor. He was involved in early vaccinations, which they've now bastardized. It was a different form of vaccination. It was inoculation. But at any rate, he observed that if we didn't write into the Bill of Rights that we had an essential right to food freedom, that we would live under a food tyranny, that they would regulate the medicine and the food and create a tyranny out of it.
Which is what's happening now, because if you eat the food, you pretty much have to take the medicine. Because it makes you sick. So one system feeds into the other system.
It's unbelievable the amount
Everyone
of tyranny.
Everyone makes money, though. Yay!
They've created an incredible tyranny completely parallel to the military-industrial complex out of medicine and food and everything in between.